The Georgia sun, heavy and honey gold, draped itself over the city of Savannah. It filtered through the ancient, bearded oaks that lined the quiet streets, dappling the manicured lawns and historic homes in shifting patterns of light and shadow. For 72 years, Eleanor had watched this same sun rise and set from the wraparound porch of the white clapboard house on Abercorn Street. It was the house where she had built a life with Robert, her late husband, a decorated veteran whose quiet strength was as much a part of the home's foundation as its brick pillars. Now, just hours after they had laid Robert to rest with full military honors, the house felt alien, its familiar warmth leaching away. Inside, the scent of funeral lilies still hung thick in the air, cloying and suffocating. Eleanor sat stiffly on the edge of the chintz sofa, her gnarled fingers tracing the faded pattern. Across from her, their postures rigid and faces set, were her daughter Victoria and Victoria's husband, Chad. Victoria, impeccably dressed in a severe black sheath dress, looked more like a corporate executive than a grieving daughter. Chad's expression was one of impatient calculation, his eyes constantly scanning the room, mentally appraising the heirlooms. "It's not a discussion, Mother." Victoria's voice cut through the silence, sharp as shattered crystal. "It's simply the way it has to be. You can't possibly manage this house alone? The stairs, the upkeep. You're a liability." Eleanor's heart, already a fragile, aching thing in her chest, gave a painful lurch. "A liability? Victoria, this is my home. Robert and I—" "Robert is gone," Chad interjected, his tone flat and final. "And the reality is, this property is too valuable to let sentimentalities drain its worth. We've found a lovely place for you. Magnolia Manor. It has excellent reviews." Terror, cold and sharp, pierced through Eleanor's grief. Magnolia Manor was a name spoken in hushed, pitying tones, a place of linoleum floors and distant cries. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, no. I won't go." Victoria's composure snapped. "You don't have a choice," she hissed, standing up. "For years it's been all about you and Dad. His needs, his care. Well, now it's my turn. Chad and I have plans for this house, and you are not part of them. You're a burden, Mother. It's time you faced it." Before Eleanor could form a protest, Chad was already marching up the stairs to her bedroom. She heard drawers opening and closing, the brutal, efficient sounds of her life being packed away. She looked at Victoria, at the cold, resolved face of the little girl she had sung to sleep in this very house, and saw only a stranger. Minutes later, Chad descended, carrying a single worn leather suitcase, Robert's old army duffel, now stuffed with a haphazard selection of her belongings. He dropped it at her feet. "Let's go," he said, taking her firmly by the elbow. "Victoria, please," Eleanor begged, tears finally spilling down her wrinkled cheeks. Her daughter turned away, staring out the window at the quiet, sun-dappled street. Chad propelled Eleanor out the front door, onto the porch, and down the steps. The screen door slammed shut behind them with a sound of terrible finality. A few neighbors, out watering their azaleas or walking their dogs, had stopped to watch, their faces masks of shock and disbelief. Mrs. Gable from across the street put a hand over her mouth, her eyes wide. Chad set the suitcase on the sidewalk with a thud. "Don't make a scene, Eleanor. A taxi will be here in 10 minutes. Magnolia Manor is expecting you." He turned and walked back into the house without a backward glance. Eleanor stood paralyzed on the public walkway, the weight of the neighbors' pitying stares feeling heavier than the Georgian sun. The world tilted, the familiar street blurring through her tears. She was untethered, cast adrift at 72 with nothing but a suitcase and a lifetime of memories that now felt like a cruel joke. As a profound numbness began to settle over her, her gaze fell to the suitcase at her feet. Something was caught in the worn, broken zipper of the duffel bag, a small, faded corner of red fabric, unlike any of her own clothes. It was a cloth she had never seen before, deliberately tucked there, a silent, cryptic message from a past she thought she knew. The world had shrunk to the hot, unyielding concrete beneath her feet and the crushing weight of 1,000 silent judgments from the neighbors. Eleanor's breath hitched, each sob a tremor that threatened to shatter her completely. She was a ghost on her own street, a piece of furniture discarded on the curb. The slam of the screen door still echoed in her soul, a sound more final than the rifle salute at Robert's grave. It was from the periphery of her tear-blurred vision that a figure emerged. A long, dark luxury car, silent and sleek as a panther, had pulled to a stop just beyond her line of sight. The rear door opened and a man stepped out. He was tall, with a commanding presence that seemed to quiet the very air. His hair was silvered at the temples, and his face, though lined with the years, held a sharp, perceptive intelligence. He was Harrison Caldwell, a name synonymous with Atlanta's skyline and philanthropic endeavors, visiting an old friend from his college days. He had been about to leave when the distressing scene unfolded. He watched for a moment, his jaw tightening as he took in the raw anguish on the elderly woman's face, the indifferent set of the man's shoulders as he retreated into the house, and the pitiless stares of the onlookers. It was a tableau of cruel abandonment that struck a chord deep within him, resonating with a personal, painful frequency. Memories of his own grandmother, the woman who had raised him after his parents passed, flooded his mind. He remembered the fierce protectiveness he'd felt, the countless hours by her hospital bed, the promise he'd made to ensure her final years were filled with dignity and love. To see this woman treated as a disposable burden was an affront to that sacred memory. Without hesitation, he crossed the street, his steps firm and purposeful. He ignored the gawking neighbors and went straight to Eleanor's side. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low, calming baritone. He gently took her elbow, his touch offering a stability she desperately needed. "My name is Harrison Caldwell. You're coming with me." Before Eleanor could process this sudden intervention, Harrison was striding up the walkway and knocking firmly on the front door. Chad yanked it open, his face a mask of irritation. "What?" "I believe you've forgotten something," Harrison stated, his voice cutting through the humid air with the chill of authority. "Or rather, someone." Victoria appeared behind her husband, her eyes wide with surprise and indignation. "This is a private family matter. I suggest you leave." "A family matter?" Harrison's gaze swept over them, a look of pure contempt. "I see no family here. I see two vultures picking at the bones of a life they didn't build." He took a step closer, his presence filling the doorway. "I know your type. I've sat on boards with your type. Your greed is as transparent as it is pathetic. You speak of liability and burdens, but the only dead weight on this property is the moral bankruptcy you've brought into this good woman's home." Chad sputtered, his face turning red. "You can't just—" "I can, and I am," Harrison interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. He turned his back on them, a deliberate and powerful dismissal. He returned to Eleanor, who was watching him with a mixture of awe and confusion. "Eleanor," he said, his voice softening considerably, "your home for now will be with me. I have a secure apartment in Atlanta. You will be safe, you will be respected, and you will be cared for. This I promise you." He picked up the worn leather suitcase, his fingers brushing against the strange bit of red fabric caught in the zipper. A flicker of curiosity crossed his features, but he dismissed it for the moment. Guiding her gently towards the waiting car, he helped her into the plush interior, a world away from the harsh sidewalk. As the car pulled away from Abercorn Street, Eleanor looked back only once, not at the house but at the small, faded red clue that was now her only tangible link to a mystery her husband had apparently taken to his grave. The smooth, silent glide of the car through the Atlanta night was a stark contrast to the violent upheaval of the past few hours. Eleanor sat in the plush leather seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap, a statue of quiet despair. The towering skyscrapers, glittering like shards of ice, were alien and intimidating. She felt like a ghost, not only in her own home but in the world itself. Harrison, sensing her profound shock, did not press her with conversation, offering only the quiet, dignified space to breathe. His penthouse was a testament to refined taste and immense wealth, but it felt cold, a beautifully decorated shell. Harrison, however, was not. He showed her to a guest suite with a view of the city lights, his manner gentle and unwavering. "This is your space, Eleanor," he said, his voice a steady anchor. "There are no rules, no schedules. You are my guest for as long as you need. You are not, and will never be, a burden." The words were so antithetical to the ones she had heard just hours before that fresh tears, these of a confused and fragile gratitude, welled in her eyes. Once alone, the numbness began to recede, replaced by a hollow, aching loneliness that seemed to swallow the very air in the room. Her gaze fell upon the worn leather duffel bag, the only physical tether to her old life. With trembling hands, she unzipped it. The contents were a chaotic jumble, proof of Chad's careless packing. But nestled between a soft wool cardigan and a stack of handkerchiefs was a small matted form she recognized instantly. It was Barnaby, a threadbare brown velvet rabbit missing one glass eye. Robert had won it for her at a county fair 60 years ago, a silly token that had become a cherished totem of their love. Seeing it, a sob escaped her. It was the one thing they had packed that held any real meaning. She pulled the soft, familiar toy to her chest, burying her face in its velveteen fur, inhaling the faint, ghostly scent of Robert's cologne and their home. It was in this posture of utter vulnerability, curled on the edge of the bed clutching the rabbit, that she felt it, a hard, unnatural lump sewn into the plush animal's back. Confused, she ran her fingers over the small, rigid square. Her heart began to beat a strange, hopeful rhythm. With a carefulness born of a lifetime of mending clothes, she found the nearly invisible seam. Using a nail file from her purse, she picked at the threads until a small section of fabric gave way. Tucked inside the batting was a tiny, old-fashioned digital voice recorder, no bigger than a matchbox. Her breath caught. With shaking fingers, she pressed the single play button. There was a soft hiss of static, and then a voice, weathered and thin but unmistakably his, filled the quiet room. "My dearest Eleanor," Robert began, his words slightly labored. "If you're hearing this, then I'm gone, and that damn fool Chad has finally gotten his hands on my old duffel." A weak, rattling cough echoed from the speaker. "I had to do this in secret, my love. There are things about my service, about a promise I made a long time ago, that I could never burden you with. But they found me. A man named Silas Crow. He thinks I have something he lost. He's dangerous, Ellie, and I fear he might come for you." The recording crackled, the sound of his strained breathing filling the suite. The red cloth in the zipper. "It's the key. It's from the flag, the one we never got back. Find Captain James Rhodes at the VFW post on Liberty Street. He knows, he'll help you. Trust no one else." There was a long pause, filled with the sound of his love and his fear. "I am so sorry to leave you with this. Be brave, my love. I have always loved you." The recording ended with a final soft click. Eleanor sat frozen, Barnaby clutched in one hand, the tiny recorder in the other. The grief was still there, a vast and cold ocean inside her. But now something else was rising to the surface, cutting through the shock and despair like a lighthouse beam through fog. It wasn't just confusion. It was a chilling, electrifying fear. Who was Silas Crow? What flag was he talking about? And as she looked down at the small, faded piece of red fabric she had unknowingly carried with her, she knew her quiet life of grief was over, replaced by a dangerous mystery left behind by the man she thought she knew completely. The silence in the penthouse suite was absolute, broken only by the faint, mechanical hiss of the recorder. Eleanor's blood ran cold, the velvet rabbit a forgotten lump in her lap. Robert's voice, a fragile whisper from beyond the grave, painted a picture of a betrayal so intimate it stole the air from her lungs. "There's more, Ellie," his recorded voice continued, a tremor of profound shame and fury underlying the weakness. The dizziness, the confusion. It wasn't just the illness. I started to suspect. I began hiding my pills, pretending to take them. I watched them, Eleanor. I watched our daughter. A ragged breath shuddered from the speaker. Victoria would bring me my medication with a smile that never reached her eyes. Chad would linger, watching me swallow. I found a loose floorboard in the closet. I started switching the pills, taking the real ones in secret. The symptoms, they lessened. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth, a strangled gasp escaping. The memories rushed back. Robert's sudden, inexplicable declines, the doctor's bafflement, Victoria's constant, cloying presence, insisting she handle all his care. It hadn't been a tragic natural decline. It had been murder. A slow, calculated poison administered by the hands of their own child. "They're not just after the house, my love," Robert confessed, his voice thick with emotion. "They're after the business. Caldwell Consulting. I built it from nothing, and Chad sees it as his golden ticket. He's leveraged to the hilt in his own ventures. And the historic property in Charleston, the one my grandfather left us, it's sitting on a gold mine of development potential. They were waiting for me to die so they could sell it all off, piece by piece. I'm so sorry. I was too weak, too proud to believe it, until it was almost too late." The recording ended with a final, soft click, leaving a void of silence more deafening than any noise. Eleanor sat paralyzed, the truth of physical weight crushing her. Her grief was now inextricably tangled with a white-hot rage. They hadn't just cast her out. They had stolen her husband day by painful day. When Harrison entered the room some time later, drawn by the prolonged silence, he found her not broken, but transformed. Her tear-streaked face was set in a mask of grim resolve, the recorder clutched in her hand like a weapon. She played it for him without a word. As Robert's damning testimony filled the room, Harrison's usual composure shattered. A storm of fury darkened his features. He saw not just the greed, but the profound cruelty, the violation of a sacred trust. He thought of his own grandmother, and a protective, righteous anger ignited within him. He was no longer just a benevolent rescuer. He was an avenger. "This ends now," he stated, his voice low and dangerous. He took the recorder, his movements precise and purposeful. "They will answer for this." Within the hour, he had made digital copies, storing them in multiple secure locations. Then he placed a call. The woman who arrived at the penthouse an hour later was a force of nature. Susan Wright, a renowned Atlanta attorney specializing in elder law and inheritance litigation, had a reputation for being ruthlessly effective. Her sharp, intelligent eyes missed nothing, and her handshake was firm. "Harrison," she said, nodding before turning her full attention to Eleanor. "Mrs. Abernathy, I've reviewed the preliminary details. What was done to you and your husband is not just a civil matter. It's homicide and criminal elder abuse." She opened a sleek leather portfolio. "We will hit them with everything: wrongful death, undue influence, financial exploitation, and emotional distress. We will freeze all assets, including the business and the Charleston property, pending a full forensic accounting. They will not see a single cent." As Susan laid out the brutal, meticulous strategy, a flicker of hope ignited in Eleanor's chest. She was not just a victim, she was the key witness in her husband's defense. "There is, however, one significant challenge," Susan continued, her tone turning grave. "The recording is powerful, but it's circumstantial. We need physical evidence. We need the pills. Without the adulterated medication to analyze, their lawyers will argue Robert was a sick, paranoid old man. We need to get back into that house on Abercorn Street and find your husband's hidden stash before Victoria and Chad discover it and destroy the only piece of evidence that can prove premeditated murder." The legal papers arrived at Harrison's penthouse with the cold finality of a judge's gavel. Served by a grim-faced process server, the lawsuit was a masterclass in malicious fiction. Victoria and Chad Abernathy were suing Harrison Caldwell for elder kidnapping, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and undue influence. The documents painted a heartbreakingly false picture. A mentally fragile Eleanor, freshly widowed and vulnerable, being whisked away from her loving family by a predatory billionaire who was systematically coercing her in a campaign to seize the Abernathy family estate. Harrison's jaw was a tight line as he read the allegations. Aloud to Eleanor and Susan Wright. "They're claiming I've isolated you, that you're not of sound mind, and that my benevolence is a calculated scheme to loot your inheritance." Before Eleanor could even process this grotesque inversion of the truth, her phone chimed with a series of alerts. A wave of dizziness washed over her as she stared at the screen. Every single one of her bank accounts, including the joint one she had shared with Robert for 50 years, had been frozen. Victoria, as the newly appointed executor of Robert's estate, had wielded her power with surgical cruelty. The message was clear. They were cutting off all her resources, hoping to strangle her financially and force her into submission. "This is a common tactic," Susan stated, her voice coldly analytical, though her eyes burned with indignation. "They are weaponizing the legal system. By framing you as the victim of a predatory outsider, They seek to invalidate your agency and any claims you might bring against them. The court of public opinion is often tried before the actual court, and these allegations are designed to smear both of you. The complexity of the battle had just multiplied exponentially. It was no longer a clandestine mission to retrieve evidence. It was now a public legal war on two fronts. Harrison's reputation, though formidable, was not impervious to scandal. The headlines, "Philanthropist accused of preying on grieving widow," would be catnip for the media. They had to proceed with extreme caution. Every move was now under a microscope. Harrison placed a calming hand on Eleanor's trembling shoulder. "Their desperation is showing, Eleanor. They are terrified because they know what they've done. This is not a setback. It is their opening gambit." He turned to Susan. "We respond immediately. File a counterclaim for wrongful death, criminal neglect, and financial exploitation. And we go after them for malicious prosecution. We will not be playing defense." As Susan began drafting the fiery response, a new, more immediate problem presented itself. A contact at the Savannah Police Department, a friend of Harrison's, called with an urgent warning. "Caldwell, I just saw the report. Your loving daughter and son-in-law have officially reported Eleanor as a vulnerable missing person, claiming she's been taken by an unknown assailant and may be in imminent danger. They've given your description and your car's details. If you're spotted driving back into Savannah with her, any patrol car in the state will be legally obligated to pull you over and separate the two of you for her own safety." Getting her into that house just became exponentially more dangerous. The legal gauntlet thrown by Victoria and Chad had transformed their quiet mission into a high-stakes siege. With Eleanor effectively branded a missing person and Harrison a kidnapper in the eyes of the law, a direct approach to the Abercorn Street house was impossible. Yet the need for the hidden pills was more urgent than ever. While Harrison's legal team prepared a blistering counteroffensive, he and Susan Wright shifted their focus to the other pillar of the conspiracy, the systematic theft of Robert's legacy. Harrison, leveraging his vast network, initiated a deep forensic audit of Caldwell Consulting. Simultaneously, Susan used her subpoena power to begin untangling the web of property deeds. It was in the cold, hard light of financial records that the true scope of the betrayal was revealed. The crime was not merely one of passion or impatience. It was a cold, premeditated corporate coup. The audit uncovered a series of transactions that made the accountants blanch. Just 3 months prior to Robert's death, majority ownership of Caldwell Consulting had been quietly transferred from Robert to Victoria through a newly created shell corporation. The signature on the documents, while a skilled forgery to a casual observer, raised red flags with the digital forensic experts Harrison employed. The pressure points of the pen were inconsistent. The lines shaky in places Robert's hand, even in illness, had been firm. It was the signature of a man under duress, or worse, a man barely conscious. The property records revealed an identical pattern. The deed to the white clapboard house on Abercorn Street, and more damningly, the historic property in Charleston, had been signed over to a joint trust in Victoria and Chad's names. The dates were telling. All the signings clustered in a 2-week period when Robert's health had taken one of its most severe and now suspicious declines. "This is beyond forgery," Susan stated, her voice tight with fury as she laid the documents out on Harrison's conference table. "This is fraud on an industrial scale. They didn't just wait for him to die. They actively stole his life's work while he was sedated and helpless in his own home." But a forged signature was difficult to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. They needed a witness, someone who could place Victoria and Chad in the room, who could testify to Robert's incapacitated state. Harrison's investigators began digging into the employees of Caldwell Consulting, focusing on those who had recently left or been let go. They found their lead in Arthur Phelps, the company's longtime comptroller who had been laid off in a restructuring just days after Robert's funeral. Phelps was a nervous man, his face etched with the guilt of a silent accomplice. After initial reluctance, a meeting was arranged in a secure, neutral location, a private study room in the Atlanta Central Library. He spoke in a hushed, frantic tone. "Mr. Caldwell was not himself," Phelps began, wringing his hands. He was confused, his speech slurred. Chad had called me to the house, said Robert needed help with some urgent tax documents." When I arrived, Robert was propped up in bed, barely coherent. Victoria was there holding the papers, guiding his hand. She kept saying, "Just sign here, Daddy, it's for the best. We'll take care of everything." He was in no state to understand what he was signing. I knew it. I saw the look in Chad's eyes, a threat. He told me my loyalty to the new management would be rewarded and my disloyalty would be catastrophic. For me and my family. Phelps looked up, his eyes pleading. I was due to retire. I was scared. I did nothing, and I have lived with that shame every day since. Arthur Phelps was now their silent witness, a terrified man who could directly link the couple to the act of coercing and incapacitated Robert. With his testimony and the forensic analysis of the documents, they had the foundation for a massive fraud case to accompany the wrongful death suit. The noose was tightening, yet the most critical piece of evidence, the physical proof of the poisoning, remained tantalizingly out of reach, locked inside the house they could not enter. The lawsuit and the missing person report had made the property a fortress. Harrison's lead investigator, a former military intelligence officer, had just delivered his latest report. Victoria and Chad had installed a top-of-the-line security system, complete with motion sensors and cameras at every entrance. They were fortifying their position, and with every passing day, the risk of them discovering and destroying Robert's hidden stash of pills grew exponentially. The financial and testimonial evidence against Victoria and Chad was mounting, a damning ledger of greed that painted them as monsters. Yet for Eleanor, seated in the quiet opulence of Harrison's study, a deeper, more painful question lingered. Why? Why this specific virulent hatred? Why the need to not only steal from Robert but to erase him slowly and painfully? The fraud explained the method, but not the malevolent fuel that powered it. Harrison, sensing the unresolved anguish in her eyes, directed his investigators to dig deeper, to look beyond the recent past. "Start with the family tragedy," he instructed his lead investigator, a man named Dixon. "The son. It broke Robert. See if there's a connection." Dixon, a man whose face seemed carved from granite, returned 2 days later. The usual professional detachment was gone from his eyes, replaced by a grim, almost nauseated stillness. He placed a single thin folder on Harrison's desk. "You were right, sir. We went through old police reports, insurance claims, and tracked down the original mechanic who inspected the wreckage. The official cause was brake failure due to a ruptured line. But the mechanic, a man named Luis Garcia, who now runs a shop in Macon, always had his doubts. He was pressured to sign off on the report by his then supervisor." Dixon opened the folder. Inside were photocopies of faded, handwritten notes and a recent notarized affidavit from Garcia. He remembered the car clearly. A 1987 Ford Mustang. The brake line wasn't just worn. It had been precisely scored, a deliberate cut made to look like stress fatigue. It was sabotage. Eleanor felt the room tilt. The air grew thin. The memory of that phone call, the policeman's somber voice, the bottomless chasm of grief that had nearly consumed her and Robert, it all rushed back, fresh and raw. "Who?" Harrison asked, his voice dangerously soft. Dixon's gaze flickered to Eleanor, full of pity, before returning to Harrison. "We cross-referenced the timeline. The only new person in their lives back then was Chad Abernathy. He was a junior mechanic at the dealership, where the Mustang was serviced the week before the accident. Garcia remembers him loitering around the service bay, acting strangely. He was questioned briefly, but had an alibi. An alibi provided by whom? Harrison pressed, though the terrible truth was already coiling in the room. "By Victoria Abernathy, then just Victoria Caldwell," Dixon said quietly. "She told police she and Chad were studying together at the library all that afternoon. We pulled her college records. She had a midterm exam that day. She wasn't at the library." The pieces, horrid and unthinkable, clicked into place. The jealousy. Victoria, always fiercely competitive, had seen her older brother not as a sibling, but as an obstacle. He was the heir, the one who would inherit the budding business, the one their father was so openly proud of. Chad, ambitious and morally bankrupt even then, was the perfect instrument. The accident that had haunted Eleanor for decades, the foundational tragedy of their lives, had not been a tragedy at all. It was a meticulously planned murder, a bloody coup that had cleared the path to Robert's legacy. A sound escaped Eleanor's lips, a low, guttural moan of pure agony. This was not just greed. It was a rot that had festered in her family for over 20 years. Her daughter had not only killed her father, she had killed her brother. The child she had sung lullabies to had grown into a creature of such profound evil it defied comprehension. The loss of her son, a wound she had carried for so long, was now ripped open, not to be soothed, but to be filled with the poison of this new horrific truth. Harrison's hand found hers, his grip firm and grounding. "Eleanor," he murmured, his voice thick with a shared fury and sorrow. She looked up, her eyes, once pools of grief, now blazing with a cold, unforgiving fire. "They took my son," she whispered, the words a vow. "They took my husband. They will answer for it all." The investigation was now complete. They had the motive, the method, and a witness to the cover-up. But as they prepared to take this nuclear-level evidence to Susan Wright and the district attorney, a new, chilling problem emerged. Dixon's phone buzzed. He listened, his expression growing grimmer by the second. He ended the call and looked at Harrison. "Sir, we have a problem. Our surveillance team just reported that Chad Abernathy is on the move. He's not heading to the office or a lawyer. He's driving south out of the city, and he's packing heat. He's got a registered 9mm in his glove box, and according to a tapped phone call we just intercepted, he's not running. He's hunting. He told an associate, and I quote, 'I'm going to finish what we started.' The old bitch should have died of a broken heart years ago. He's coming for Eleanor." The revelation of their son's murder was a seismic shock that left Eleanor's world permanently fractured. Yet from the ruins of her old life, a new steely resolve was forged. She was no longer fighting for her home or her inheritance. She was fighting for justice for her husband and her murdered son. This profound shift in her was palpable, a quiet strength that seemed to fill the room as she, Harrison, and Susan Wright prepared their final, devastating legal assault. But Victoria and Chad, sensing the walls closing in, grew reckless. Their intimidation, once veiled in legal threats, now turned overt and ugly. Arthur Phelps, the former comptroller, called Harrison in a panic. "They came to my house. Chad was on my porch, screaming that I was a dead man if I talked. He said he knew where my grandchildren went to school." His voice trembled, but then it steadied. "But hearing what they did, what they really did to their own family, I can't be silent anymore. I'll testify. I'll tell the court everything." The same desperate aggression was directed at Sarah Jenkins, the private nurse who had cared for Robert in his final months. Victoria confronted her in the parking lot of a grocery store, her face a mask of cold fury. "You signed a confidentiality agreement," Victoria hissed, stepping too close. "If you breathe a word about my father's condition, we will sue you into oblivion. You'll never work again." Sarah, a woman in her late 50s with kind eyes and a spine of steel, initially shrank back, fear flashing across her face. She thought of her own modest life, her mortgage, the sheer power and wealth arrayed against her. But then she thought of Eleanor. She had seen the deep, abiding love between the elderly couple, had witnessed Eleanor's unwavering devotion during the most difficult times. She had also seen the suspicious declines that coincided perfectly with Victoria's visits. The memory of Eleanor's current courage, fighting back from the brink of utter ruin, ignited something within her. She stood her ground, her voice quiet but firm. "No, Miss Abernathy, I will not be silent." She met Victoria's glare without flinching. "I cared for your father. I respected him, and I suspected something was very wrong for a long time." Later that day, Sarah Jenkins arrived at Harrison Caldwell's building, asking to speak with Eleanor. She was ushered into the study, where Eleanor sat with Harrison. Without preamble, Sarah placed a small, sealed plastic bag on the desk. Inside were several pills, a mix of Robert's heart medication, and the diuretics he was prescribed. "I couldn't prove anything," Sarah explained, her hands clasped tightly. "But my instincts told me to be careful. On the days he would get so much worse, I started pocketing a pill or two from his dosage cup when Victoria wasn't looking. I had no real plan. I just felt I needed evidence of what was being given to him." She pointed to the pills. "These aren't his prescriptions. The markings are wrong. I believe these are high-dose diuretics, meant to mimic his medication but designed to rapidly dehydrate him and put fatal strain on his heart. It's how they made his decline look natural. This was the breakthrough. This was the physical, forensic evidence they needed to transform Robert's recorded suspicions into irrefutable proof of murder. With Arthur Phelps's testimony on the fraud and Sarah Jenkins's evidence of the poisoning, the case against Victoria and Chad was now airtight. Yet, as they celebrated this crucial victory, a cold dread settled over the room. Harrison's head of security entered, his expression grave. "We've lost Chad's signal. He was heading south on I-75, but his phone went dark an hour ago. He's not at any of their known properties, and he's not answering any lines." He paused, his gaze shifting to Eleanor. "Our contact at the Savannah PD just confirmed they found his car abandoned on the outskirts of the city. It was clean. He's switched vehicles and he's completely off the grid. He could be anywhere." The unspoken question hung heavily in the air, a silent threat that tightened every muscle in the room. The air in the Savannah courtroom was thick enough to taste, a heavy cocktail of humidity, polished wood, and palpable tension. Eleanor sat beside Harrison Caldwell, her spine straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap, a picture of quiet dignity that belied the storm raging within. Across the aisle, Victoria and Chad, flanked by their high-priced legal team, projected an aura of affronted innocence. But the cracks were showing, a nervous tick in Chad's jaw, the way Victoria's perfectly manicured fingers clenched and unclenched. The prosecution's case was a methodical, devastating avalanche. The financial documents were presented first, the forensic accountant detailing the blatant forgeries with cold clinical precision. Then came Arthur Phelps. He took the stand, a nervous man, but his voice grew stronger as he described the scene in Robert's bedroom, the incoherent man, the guiding hand of his daughter, the threatening glare of his son-in-law. He was in no condition to sign a birthday card, let alone transfer his life's work, Phelps stated, his gaze finally meeting Victoria's before she looked away, her face pale. But it was the testimony of Sarah Jenkins that turned the tide from fraud to murder. She described Robert's mysterious, cyclical declines, her growing suspicion, and her courageous decision to secretly pocket the pills. The plastic bag was entered into evidence. "These are not Robert Abernathy's prescribed medication," the state's toxicologist confirmed. "They are high-potency diuretics, which, given his cardiac condition, would have placed immense and ultimately fatal strain on his heart." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Chad shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Then the prosecutor approached the bench. "Your Honor, the state would like to enter Exhibit 17 into evidence." He held up the small, old-fashioned voice recorder. This was discovered by the victim, Eleanor Abernathy, following her unlawful eviction from her home. A strangled "objection" came from the defense table, but it was overruled. The prosecutor pressed play. Robert's voice, thin and raspy but filled with a desperate love and a terrifying clarity, filled the silent room. "My dearest Eleanor, I started to suspect. I watched our daughter. Victoria would bring me my medication with a smile that never reached her eyes. They're not just after the house, my love. They're after the business. I'm so sorry." The recording was a gut punch. Jurors stared in horror. Victoria seemed to shrink, the mask of the grieving daughter dissolving into one of exposed guilt. Chad's face was a thundercloud of fury, but the prosecution wasn't finished. "Your Honor, we have one final witness." The lead investigator took the stand and laid out the 20-year-old cold case. He presented the mechanic's affidavit, the evidence of the deliberately scored brake line, the proof of Victoria's false alibi. He connected Chad, the junior mechanic, to the scene. "The death of Michael Abernathy was not an accident," the investigator concluded, his voice ringing in the stunned silence. "It was a deliberate act of murder designed to clear a path to Robert Abernathy's legacy." The gallery erupted. Eleanor closed her eyes, the final horrific piece of the puzzle slotting into place, the ghost of her son finally avenged. The gavel cracked down. "Order! Order in the court!" When silence returned, the judge's face was grim. He looked not at the jury, but directly at the defendants. The evidence presented in this courtroom paints a picture of almost unimaginable avarice and cruelty. A systematic, decades-long campaign of theft, deception, and murder. He nodded to the bailiffs. They moved forward, their steps echoing on the hardwood floor. Victoria Abernathy, Chad Abernathy, you are hereby remanded into custody. The court finds sufficient cause to hold you without bail on charges of the murders of Michael and Robert Abernathy, criminal elder abuse, and multiple counts of fraud. The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut was the most satisfying sound Eleanor had ever heard. Victoria cried out, a short, sharp sob of utter ruin as she was pulled to her feet. Chad struggled for a moment, his eyes wild, shouting obscenities before he was subdued and led away. The courtroom devolved into a cacophony of reporters and shocked spectators. Eleanor felt Harrison's steadying hand on her arm. It was over. Justice, cold and long delayed, had finally been served. Yet, as she watched her daughter being led away in chains, a profound and complex emptiness settled within her. The battle was won, the monsters were caged, but the wounds they had inflicted would never fully heal. The house on Abercorn Street was hers again, the businesses would be restored, but they were hollow victories. She had lost her son, her husband, and the daughter she thought she had, all to a poison more insidious than any pill. The gavel had fallen, but in its echo, Eleanor was left alone with the silent, aching cost of survival, and the daunting question of what one builds from the ashes of a life so completely shattered. The weeks that followed the verdict were a blur of legal proceedings and quiet, profound adjustments. With Victoria and Chad held without bail, the intricate web of fraud they had woven began to unravel with satisfying speed. The courts moved swiftly to nullify the forged documents, and Eleanor was formally restored as the sole heir to Robert's entire estate. The house on Abercorn Street, the thriving business of Caldwell Consulting, and the valuable Charleston property were all returned to her, their titles cleansed of the taint of betrayal. The fortune, once a target for vultures, was now hers to steward. Yet, the vast, silent rooms of the Abercorn house held only echoes of pain. Eleanor walked through them one afternoon, Harrison a silent, supportive presence at her side. She trailed her fingers over the banister where she'd last seen Robert descend, past the sofa where Victoria had called her a burden. The beautiful home was a gilded cage of traumatic memories. I can't live here, Harrison, she said, her voice steady but filled with a deep sorrow. Every corner holds a ghost, not just of Robert, but of what they did to him, to us. Harrison nodded, his gaze sweeping the grand, sunlit parlor. Then what will you do with it? It's a prime piece of real estate. You could sell it and never want for anything. Eleanor looked out the window at the ancient bearded oaks, their branches offering dappled shade to the street where she had been so publicly cast out. An idea, fragile at first, then blooming with purpose, began to form. It was an answer to the cruelty she had endured, a way to honor Robert's memory and reclaim the narrative of this place. No, she said, turning to him, a new light in her eyes. I won't sell it. I'm going to give it back. She gestured around them. This house was built for a family, for love. It should be a place of safety, not suffering. I want to turn it into Robert's Haven, a community center for seniors and families in crisis. A place where no one will ever be made to feel like a burden. Harrison's smile was one of deep admiration. It's perfect, Eleanor. A sanctuary born from the very place that tried to break you. The transformation was immediate and cathartic. Architects and contractors, funded by the restored Abernathy fortune and supplemented by Harrison's generous donations, began the work. The formal living room, once a stage for a family's destruction, was being converted into a bright, welcoming common area. The master suite, where Robert had been slowly poisoned, was being refitted as a medical consultation room. The grand dining table, around which so many silent, tense meals had been eaten, would soon host community lunches. As Eleanor supervised the initial demolition, watching a sledgehammer tear down the wall of the closet where Robert had hidden his evidence, she felt a weight lift. She was not just renovating a house, she was exorcising its demons. The symbolism was not lost on her. They were literally breaking down the walls of secrecy and pain, building something new and hopeful from the rubble. Yet amidst the sounds of construction and the bright vision for the future, a small, physical reminder of the past remained. One of the workers, clearing out the attic for conversion into office space, approached her holding a small, tarnished metal lockbox. It was dusty and unassuming, tucked away behind an old steamer trunk. "Found this, ma'am," he said. "It's locked tight. Doesn't look like it's been touched in years." Eleanor took the box, its weight surprising in her hands. It was not one she recognized, and Robert had never mentioned it. As the buzz of renewal filled the air around her, the silent, mysterious box felt like a last secret waiting to be uncovered, a final whisper from the past before the future could truly begin. The transformation of the white-clapboard house was a symphony of renewal. The air, once thick with the cloying scent of lilies and silence, now vibrated with the sounds of hammers, saws, and the cheerful shouts of contractors. Eleanor, who had once felt like a ghost in her own home, now moved through the chaos with a quiet authority. She made decisions about paint colors and floor plans, her voice firm, her choices deliberate. With every sheet of drywall installed, every window replaced to let in more light, she felt a piece of her own internal wreckage being cleared away. She was not just building a community center. She was reconstructing herself. One late afternoon, when the workers had left for the day, she found Harrison in the backyard, standing under the ancient oak where Robert's favorite swing still hung. The Georgia sun, now a gentle, forgiving gold, filtered through the leaves, painting his thoughtful profile in soft light. The manicured lawn was a testament to Robert's care, a living legacy that was now being honored. Eleanor joined him, the quiet between them comfortable and deep. She watched a cardinal flit between the branches, its red a vibrant splash against the green, a stark contrast to the faded, cryptic red cloth that had started it all. "Harrison," she began, her voice soft but clear, carrying over the distant hum of Savannah traffic. "You stepped into the wreckage of my life, and you rebuilt me. You gave me a home, a purpose, and you fought for me as if I were your own." She paused, gathering the immense courage this question required. "I know you were Robert's friend, but what you've done, it's gone so far beyond that. I have a room in your home, but you've given me a place in your life. So I need to ask you, would you consider letting me make it official? Would you let me be your mother, in the ways that truly matter?" Harrison turned to her, and for the first time since she had known him, the formidable billionaire's composure completely dissolved. His eyes, usually so sharp and perceptive, welled with tears that caught the evening light. He took both of her gnarled hands in his own, his grip strong and sure. "Eleanor," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "when I saw you on that sidewalk, it wasn't just Robert's memory that moved me. It was you. It was the profound dignity in your posture, even in your utter devastation. The love I have for you was not born out of pity for my late friend. It was born in that moment, and it has grown every day since, watching your strength, your resilience, your incredible capacity to turn pain into purpose." A tear traced a path down his cheek. "My answer is yes, 1,000 times yes, but not because of a legal document, because you have become my family. You are the mother my heart recognized." Eleanor felt a sob of pure, unadulterated joy catch in her throat. She reached up and cupped his face, her thumb gently wiping away his tear. In that touch, a lifetime of loneliness and betrayal finally released its hold. The hole torn by Victoria's cruelty was not just patched. It was filled with a love that was chosen, deliberate, and unshakable. She had lost a daughter born of her blood, but she had found a son born of her spirit. As they stood together in the garden, the future of Robert's haven taking shape behind them, Eleanor felt a profound peace settle over her soul. The battle was over, her past was honored, and her future was secure in this new, beautiful family. Yet, as the twilight deepened, her gaze drifted back towards the house, to the attic window where the mysterious lockbox now sat on her new desk, its silent, tarnished surface holding one last secret, waiting in the quiet of the newly peaceful home. The legal adoption papers, signed and sealed by a sympathetic judge who knew the full extent of the case, felt lighter than air in Harrison's hands. They were not a contract, but a covenant. He was no longer merely Eleanor's protector or benefactor. He was now, legally and in every way that mattered, her son. The ceremony was small, held in the judge's chambers, but the weight of it filled the room. Eleanor signed her name with a steady hand, her heart so full she thought it might bloom right out of her chest. A month later, the transformation was complete. The house on Abercorn Street, once a monument to private grief and betrayal, now stood as Robert's Haven, its fresh white paint and gleaming black shutters a beacon of hope. The grand opening was a community celebration. The manicured lawn was filled with neighbors, veterans, local families, and politicians, all buzzing with admiration. The air smelled of grilled corn and fresh-cut grass, a world away from the cloying scent of funeral lilies. Harrison stood by Eleanor's side, his hand resting gently on the back of her wheelchair, a temporary concession to her emotional exhaustion, not a symbol of frailty. The local news crew filmed as the mayor finished his speech praising Eleanor's incredible generosity. Then it was her turn. Harrison helped her to the podium. She adjusted the microphone, her gnarled fingers steady. She looked out at the sea of faces, Mrs. Gable from across the street, now smiling through tears. Sarah Jenkins beaming with pride, Arthur Phelps standing a little taller. Her gaze swept over the vibrant community that had once witnessed her humiliation and was now sharing in her redemption. "This house was built on a foundation of love," she began, her voice clear and resonant, carrying on the warm breeze. For a time, that foundation was cracked by fear. Fear of being a burden, fear of being alone, fear of a future that had been stolen. She paused, her eyes meeting Harrison's, drawing strength from the unwavering love she saw there. But love is a more powerful builder than fear. With love, we have torn down the walls of silence and pain. With love, we have rebuilt these rooms not for one family, but for all families. This place is a testament to my Robert spirit and to the truth that no one is ever truly alone. She took a deep, final breath, her declaration ringing out with the power of a vow. "And I am not afraid anymore." The applause was thunderous, a wave of acceptance and joy that washed over her, cleansing the last of the old wounds. As the crowd surged forward, Harrison leaned down and kissed her cheek. "I am so proud to be your son, Mother." Together, mother and son, they moved to the wide-open front door, now stripped of its imposing, memory-laden screen. The crowd parted for them. Eleanor placed her hand on the sun-warmed wood of the doorframe, a final, gentle goodbye to the past. Then, with Harrison's hand covering hers, they pushed the door open wide. The gesture was symbolic, an invitation. The community streamed in, their laughter and conversation immediately filling the bright, welcoming spaces. Children darted into the new play area, seniors settled into comfortable armchairs in the sunroom, and the scent of coffee from the community kitchen promised warmth and fellowship. Eleanor watched it all, a serene smile on her face. She was home, not in a house, but in a purpose, in a community, and in the heart of her son. The Georgia sun, now gentle and benevolent, shone down on Robert's Haven, a golden promise of a new beginning built, impossibly and beautifully, from the ashes of the old.